On a freezing morning in Blackwater Harbor, a billionaire walked past a little girl shivering alone on a bus stop bench. She whispered just 4 words. "Mister, my chest hurts." That moment pulled him into a dangerous truth about poisoned water, a missing mother, and a secret powerful men would kill to keep buried. Winter had tightened its grip around Blackwater Harbor like a silent fist. The river beyond downtown exhaled pale mist into the gray morning air, and the sidewalks glittered with a thin layer of ice that made every step careful and uncertain. People hurried past one another with their collars raised and their heads lowered, each person wrapped inside their own small world of schedules, coffee cups, and morning obligations. For Callan Voss, mornings were a ritual of control. At 42, he had built his life around precision. Billion-dollar clean energy contracts, glass towers overlooking the harbor boardrooms, where his decisions shifted entire markets. Everything in his world followed structure, timing, numbers, efficiency. Chaos did not belong in his schedule. The revolving door of his penthouse building whispered closed behind him as he stepped onto the sidewalk, coat, perfectly tailored gloves, smooth and dark against the winter light. His assistant's voice murmured through the wireless earpiece. "Investor call at 9, strategy briefing at 10, and the Halcyon acquisition review is at 1. They want your position finalized today." Callan walked quickly toward the waiting car 2 blocks away. "I'll review the financial model before the call," he said calmly. "Send it to my tablet." "Yes, sir." Everything moved exactly the way it always did, until something small and motionless at the edge of the bus stop bench pulled his attention. At first he did not look directly, just a shape, something out of place. He kept walking. Then the wind shifted, and he saw bare knees trembling violently beneath a thin, faded dress. Callan slowed. The child sitting on the bench looked impossibly small against the frozen metal seat. Her dark hair hung in damp strands against pale cheeks, and her arms wrapped tightly around herself as if she were trying to hold her own ribs together. No coat, no gloves, just a dress that belonged to summer. People passed without stopping. A man hurried by, speaking loudly into his phone. 2 teenagers brushed past with backpacks and laughter. A woman glanced once at the girl, hesitated, and kept walking. Callan told himself the obvious explanation. Someone would notice. Someone would help. He took another step forward. Then the little girl lifted her face. Her lips were bluish with cold, and her breath left only the faintest cloud in the air. "Mister," she whispered. Her voice was barely louder than the wind. "My chest hurts so much." Callan stopped walking. Behind him, the city continued moving as if nothing unusual had happened. But the sound of her breathing thin, fragile wrong hung in the air between them like a warning. Callan stood frozen for a moment, caught between instinct and habit. His assistant was still speaking through the earpiece. "And the board is expecting your revised projections," before the girl coughed. It was not the soft cough of a cold. It tore violently through her small body, a scraping, desperate sound that made her shoulders jerk forward, as if something inside her chest had suddenly locked shut. She gasped afterward, trying to pull air into lungs that did not seem willing to cooperate. Callan's chest tightened. The perfect rhythm of his morning cracked. "Hold on," he murmured into the headset. He pulled the device from his ear and ended the call without explanation. Across the city, his assistant stared at the deadline in confusion. Callan approached the bench slowly, careful not to startle the child. "Hey," he said quietly. "Can you hear me?" The girl blinked up at him. Her eyes were large and dark, shining with the kind of exhaustion no child should know. "It hurts," she whispered again, pressing one trembling hand against the center of her chest. That was enough. Callan shrugged off his heavy wool coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. The fabric swallowed her small frame instantly, but she clutched it tightly with both hands, as if it were the first warm thing she had felt in days. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Elsie." Her voice was barely audible. "I'm cold." Callan swallowed hard. He slipped one arm beneath her knees and the other behind her back, lifting her carefully. She weighed almost nothing, frighteningly light, like a bird with hollow bones. As he carried her toward the street, he felt something against his palm. Her heartbeat. It wasn't steady. It fluttered in quick, uneven bursts, fast, then slow, then skipping entirely, like a frightened animal trying to escape a cage. For the first time in years, Callan Voss felt genuine fear. This wasn't just a cold morning. Something inside this child was terribly wrong. He stepped into the street and waved desperately for a taxi. "Stay with me," he murmured softly as her head rested weakly against his chest. "We're getting you help." The sliding glass doors of St. Margaret's Medical Center hissed open as Callan rushed inside with Elsie in his arms. Warm air flooded over them, chasing away the bitter winter wind. But Elsie didn't relax. Her small fingers remained tangled tightly in the front of his shirt, as if letting go might send her drifting back into the cold again. Her breathing was shallow, uneven, each inhale followed by a faint wheeze that made Callan's stomach twist. The nurse at the intake desk looked up in alarm. "Sir, what happened?" "I found her outside," Callan said quickly. "She can barely breathe and her heartbeat feels irregular." Within seconds, the emergency team moved into action. A gurney appeared beside him. Nurses gently tried to lift Elsie from his arms, but the moment they touched her, she tightened her grip on his coat. "Don't leave," she whispered. The words stopped everyone for a second. Callan forced a reassuring smile. "I'm not going anywhere," he told her. "They just need to help you." Slowly, reluctantly, her fingers loosened. The nurses wheeled her through double doors toward the pediatric emergency bay, while machines beeped and monitors flickered to life around her small body. Callan remained standing just outside the room, suddenly unsure what to do with his hands. A doctor entered moments later. Dr. Sienna Vale, a calm woman with sharp eyes and years of quiet authority, studied the monitor readings carefully before glancing toward Callan. "Oxygen levels are low," she murmured to the nurses. She examined Elsie's fingernails, then her lips. A faint crease formed between her brows. "This isn't a normal infection," she said quietly. Callan felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. "You mean, she's been sick for a while?" Dr. Vale looked back at the fragile girl lying in the hospital bed. "Yes," she said gently. "Whatever is hurting this child, it didn't start today." And in that moment, Callan Voss realized the frozen bench outside the bus stop might only be the beginning of a much darker story. The hospital room hummed softly with the quiet rhythm of machines. Elsie slept beneath a thin white blanket, her breathing shallow but steadier now, with oxygen flowing through the small tube beneath her nose. Every few seconds, the monitor beside the bed gave a gentle beep, a mechanical reassurance that her fragile body was still holding on. Callan sat beside the bed in a stiff plastic chair, his expensive suit jacket folded over the back. He had stopped checking his phone an hour ago. For the first time in years, nothing outside that room seemed urgent. When a nurse returned to check Elsie's vitals, she gently rolled the little girl onto her side to listen to her lungs. That was when Callan noticed it. A thin layer of gray dust along the collar of her dress. Not normal dirt, not street grime. It looked metallic. "Is that normal?" he asked quietly. The nurse leaned closer, brushing a finger lightly against the fabric. A faint streak appeared. Her brow furrowed. "Could be soot," she said uncertainly. "But it's strange." She stepped out to deliver the blood work results that had just come back from the lab. Minutes later, Dr. Sienna Vale returned with a tablet in her hand and a different expression on her face. The calm reassurance she had earlier was gone. "Mr. Voss," she said quietly, "the tests show elevated heavy metal markers in her bloodstream." Callan felt his stomach tighten. "Heavy metals," Dr. Vale nodded. "There are also signs of chronic inflammation in her lungs." She glanced toward the sleeping girl before continuing. This kind of damage doesn't happen in a single day. Callan stared at Elsie's tiny chest rising and falling beneath the blanket. You're saying she's been exposed to something? Dr. Vale hesitated only briefly. Yes. And whatever it is, it's been hurting her for a long time. Child Services arrived shortly afterward. Naomi Reyes introduced herself quietly, her tone calm but efficient. She had the look of someone who had spent years navigating the fragile spaces between crisis and compassion. Do you know where the girl lives? She asked Callan. He shook his head. She only told me her name. Naomi nodded and stepped outside to access the hospital intake database. When she returned, her expression had changed slightly. Elsie Rowan, she said. 7 years old. She turned the tablet so Callan could see the address. Mariners Crossing Apartments. Callan felt a faint chill run down his spine. The complex sat directly along the industrial riverbank, a neglected strip of housing not far from the chemical plants south of the harbor. He had seen it on environmental reports years ago. Naomi continued scanning the file. One emergency contact. Her mother, Maris Rowan. Can you reach her? Naomi shook her head. Phone disconnected. No recent employment records either. Inside the room, a small plastic bin held the few items that had been found with Elsie when she arrived. Her shoes, a broken hair clip, and a small backpack. Callan unzipped it carefully. Inside was a crumpled sheet of paper covered in childish marker drawings. A river colored deep black across the middle of the page. On one side stood a tiny house and 2 stick figures labeled Me and Mom. On the other side loomed a gray building with crooked smokestacks, spilling dark clouds into the sky. Above it, written in uneven letters, The Bad Water Place. Callan stared at the drawing for a long time. Children rarely invented fears like that. They drew what they lived beside. Evening settled slowly over the hospital. The windows outside the pediatric wing glowed faintly with orange streetlight as snow drifted past the glass. The corridors were quieter now, visitors gone, nurses moving softly between rooms. Callan stood in the hallway speaking with Naomi when she delivered the news he had been half expecting. If we can't locate her mother soon, she said carefully, Elsie will need to be placed in emergency foster care. Callan glanced through the glass toward the hospital bed. The little girl looked impossibly small beneath the blanket. She can't stay here forever, Naomi added gently, and she can't go back to that apartment alone. Before Callan could respond, a soft sound interrupted them. Small footsteps. They both turned. Elsie stood in the doorway of her hospital room, the IV line trailing behind her. She looked pale and unsteady, clutching the doorframe with one trembling hand. Please, she whispered. A nurse hurried toward her. Sweetheart, you need to stay in bed. But Elsie shook her head. Her eyes were locked on Callan. Don't send me away, she said desperately. Mom just went to tell people about the water. She said she'd come right back. Her voice broke. I'll be good, I promise. Then the coughing started. A violent, choking cough that bent her small body forward as she struggled to breathe. Her legs gave out. Callan moved without thinking. He caught her before she hit the floor. Elsie clutched his shirt with weak fingers, her heartbeat fluttering wildly against his chest. The hallway had fallen silent. Naomi watched the scene with quiet understanding. In that moment, something changed. Callan Voss was no longer just the man who had found her on a bench, and they both knew it. After the collapse in the hallway, the hospital staff moved quickly. Elsie was transferred into a quiet private room at the far end of the pediatric wing. The lights were dimmer there, the corridor calmer, the noise of emergency carts and hurried footsteps replaced by the gentle hum of machines and the soft rhythm of falling snow outside the window. Elsie lay propped against white pillows, oxygen tubing resting beneath her nose. Her breathing had steadied again, though each inhale still carried a faint wheeze. A stuffed fox from the hospital toy cart sat beside her pillow. Callan remained in the chair beside the bed. He had not left once. His tie hung loose now, his jacket folded on the chair, his phone silent on the table beside him. Somewhere across the city, meetings had been missed calls, unanswered decisions postponed. None of it seemed to matter. Elsie studied him quietly for a moment before speaking. "You don't have to stay," she murmured. "You look busy." Callan gave a faint smile. "Not tonight." She looked down at the blanket, her small fingers tracing the fabric slowly. "Mom says people like you don't stay long," she said softly. The words landed heavier than she probably realized. Callan leaned forward slightly. "And what do you think?" Elsie shrugged one fragile shoulder. "People leave," she whispered. "They always have somewhere else to go." For a moment, Callan said nothing. Then he spoke in a quieter voice than he had used with anyone in years. "When I was your age," he said, "I had a little brother." Elsie looked up. "He got sick." Callan continued slowly, "and there wasn't anyone powerful enough to help him." The room fell silent. "Did he get better?" she asked. Callan shook his head. "No." Elsie's gaze softened. Then she asked the question that mattered most. "If you help me, will you help my mom too?" Callan met her eyes. "Yes," he said quietly. "I will." Later that evening, Naomi Reyes met Callan in a small conference room near the pediatric ward. Stacks of paperwork covered the table. Guardianship forms, medical consent documents, state custody notices. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead. Naomi folded her arms as she studied him. "There is a legal option," she said carefully. "If Elsie's mother can't be located soon, someone can petition for temporary medical guardianship." Callan glanced at the documents. "What does that involve?" "It means responsibility," Naomi replied. "You would make medical decisions for her. You would be responsible for her safety. And if the court approves it, she would remain under your care until her mother is found." Callan ran a hand slowly across the table. "And if I don't," Naomi did not soften the truth, "she'll enter the foster system." Callan looked through the glass window toward Elsie's room. She was asleep again, curled slightly toward the door, as if even in sleep she expected people to disappear. Naomi spoke again, her tone lower now. "There's another complication." Callan looked back at her. "You're a public figure," she said. "A billionaire. The press will question your motives. Let them." Naomi held his gaze. "And if the contamination investigation leads back to the chemical plants near the river, you'll be stepping directly into a corporate war." Silence stretched between them. Callan finally picked up the pen. "When I was a kid," he said quietly, "no one stayed for my brother." He signed the first form. "Someone is staying this time." The next morning, Callan walked into the boardroom of Voss Meridian Energy looking like a different man. His normally perfect routine had vanished. His tie was loose, his expression sharper, and the calm certainty that usually controlled the room had been replaced by something far more dangerous: conviction. The board members waited around the long, polished table screens glowing with financial projections and market forecasts. Callan did not begin with numbers. He began with the truth. "A 7-year-old girl was admitted to St. Margaret's yesterday," he said. He described the frozen bench, the thin dress, the coughing, the blood tests. When he finished, the room was silent for exactly 3 seconds. Then one of the directors leaned back thoughtfully. "If the contamination links to Halcyon's South Basin plant," she said slowly, "this could be an extraordinary strategic opportunity." Another director nodded. "Their stock would collapse. Public sympathy would be enormous." Callan's hand slammed against the table. The sound echoed through the room. "She is not a strategy." The directors froze. You will not use a dying child as leverage for market advantage. Callan continued, his voice dangerously calm. A silver-haired board member leaned forward. You're proposing we publicly accuse a major competitor of poisoning a community. He folded his hands. Are you really prepared to risk this company for one little girl? Callan held his gaze. This isn't about risk, he said quietly. It's about the kind of people we choose to be. The room remained silent, but Callan could already see the truth in their eyes. Not everyone in that boardroom was standing with him anymore. And somewhere along the poisoned riverbank of Blackwater Harbor, powerful men were about to realize someone had started asking the wrong questions. 2 days later, Callan sat in a quiet office overlooking the frozen harbor, across from a man who had built his career fighting corporations far larger than himself. Gideon Pike did not look like the kind of lawyer billionaires usually hired. His suit was wrinkled, his tie hung crooked, and his office smelled faintly of old paper and burnt coffee, but his reputation was legendary. Gideon flipped slowly through the photographs Callan had taken inside Maris Rowan's apartment, the jars of cloudy water, the handwritten notes, the river samples, the printed emails scattered across the kitchen table. He paused at the drawing from Elsie's backpack. The Black River, the crooked smokestacks, the words "Bad Water Place" written above it. Gideon leaned back in his chair. Children don't invent things like this, he said quietly. No. Callan's voice was steady. They draw what they see every day. Gideon nodded slowly, and the chemical markers in her blood. Confirmed, Callan replied. Dr. Vale believes the contamination has been happening for years. The lawyer was silent for a moment. Then he closed the folder. If we take this case, Gideon said carefully, we won't just be challenging a company. He leaned forward slightly. We'll be challenging an entire system that has spent decades protecting companies like Halcyon Chemical. Callan met his eyes. That's exactly why I'm here. Gideon studied him for another moment. Then let me ask the only question that matters. He tapped the folder once. Do you want justice, or do you want to win a corporate war? Callan didn't hesitate. I want the truth. The lawyer gave a small nod. Good, he said. Because once we start this, they will come after everything you have. They didn't wait long. 3 days after Gideon Pike filed the first request for a federal environmental investigation, the story exploded across national media. But not the way Callan expected. The first headline appeared before sunrise. Billionaire CEO accused of using sick child to attack business rival. Another followed within hours. Corporate power play disguised as charity. By noon, the narrative had spread everywhere. Talk shows debated his motives. Financial analysts questioned the timing. Anonymous sources suggested Callan Voss had orchestrated the entire situation to weaken Halcyon's stock price. Even some investors from his own company called demanding explanations. Callan ignored them all. That evening he sat in Elsie's hospital room while snow tapped softly against the window. She was awake, drawing quietly with markers on a hospital notepad. When she noticed his expression, she tilted her head. Are you in trouble? She asked softly. Callan forced a small smile. No. Because of me. The question hit harder than any headline. He set his phone aside and leaned closer. You didn't cause any of this, he said gently. Then why are people mad at you? She asked. Callan thought for a moment before answering. Because sometimes the truth makes powerful people uncomfortable. Elsie considered that carefully. Then she nodded. My mom says that too. Callan felt something tighten in his chest, because suddenly the story wasn't just about poisoned water anymore. It was about a woman who had already tried to tell the truth and disappeared while doing it. The call from Gideon Pike came just after midnight. Callan stepped quietly into the hospital hallway before answering. You're going to want to see this, the lawyer said. His voice carried a new tension. 30 minutes later, Callan sat across from him again, as Gideon opened a secure laptop on the desk. A folder appeared on the screen. Dozens of internal documents, engineering reports, environmental inspections, email chains between executives, all from Halcyon Chemical. Anonymous whistleblower, Gideon said. Someone inside the company just handed us their entire nightmare. Callan leaned forward. The first report dated back nearly 6 years. It described chemical leakage into the groundwater along the Blackwater Harbor riverbank, the same area where Mariners Crossing apartments stood. The recommendation was simple: immediate cleanup required. But the next document told a different story. An internal email from a Halcyon executive. Too expensive. Monitor quietly. Another message followed months later. Community complaints rising. Redirect responsibility to municipal water system. Then one final email appeared on the screen. Short, cold, calculated. The Rowan woman is gathering water samples again. Legal should prepare containment strategy. Callan felt the blood drain from his face. Rowan, he whispered. Elsie's mother. Gideon nodded grimly. She wasn't paranoid, he said. She was right. The lawyer closed the laptop slowly. And now we know why she disappeared. Callan stared through the hospital window toward the quiet pediatric room where Elsie slept. For the first time since this began, the truth was unmistakable. This wasn't an accident. It was a cover-up. And somewhere inside Halcyon Chemical, people had already decided that a mother asking questions was a problem that needed to disappear. 3 days after the whistleblower files arrived, Blackwater Harbor woke to a storm. Not a weather storm. A media storm. Outside the marble steps of the city courthouse, cameras crowded together like steel insects. Microphones pushed forward. Satellite vans lined the street. Reporters shouted questions before the conference even began. For years, Halcyon Chemical had been one of the most powerful corporations in the region. Its factories provided thousands of jobs along the harbor. Its executives sat on charity boards and civic councils. Its name appeared on hospital wings and university buildings. But that morning, for the first time, someone was standing in public and questioning everything. Callan Voss stepped to the podium. Snow clouds drifted across the gray sky above the courthouse, and the wind carried the faint metallic scent of the river below. The microphones flickered alive. Callan looked out across the crowd. For a moment, he saw not reporters, not cameras, but a small hospital room where a fragile girl struggled to breathe. He began quietly. 2 weeks ago, he said, I found a 7-year-old girl sitting on a frozen bench in this city. The crowd grew still. She was alone. She had no coat. She could barely breathe. Some reporters glanced at their notes. Callan continued. Doctors later confirmed that the child had been exposed to industrial toxins over a long period of time. A murmur moved through the press line. Callan didn't raise his voice, but every word carried. Her home sits along the Blackwater Harbor riverbank, less than a mile from the Halcyon South Basin facility. Now the silence sharpened. Documents provided by a whistleblower inside Halcyon indicate the company was aware of groundwater contamination years ago. Behind him, large screens displayed copies of the internal reports Gideon Pike had obtained. One by one, the documents appeared. Engineering warnings, environmental audits, internal emails discussing how to avoid public disclosure. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A reporter shouted, Mr. Voss, are you accusing Halcyon Chemical of poisoning the community? Callan met the cameras. I'm saying the evidence suggests that children in this city may have been exposed to dangerous contamination, while the company responsible chose not to act. Another reporter raised a hand. Critics say you're exploiting a sick child to damage a competitor. Callan didn't hesitate. I'm protecting a child who nearly died because adults with power chose profit over responsibility. The wind lifted slightly across the courthouse steps. Her name is Elsie Rowan, Callan continued, and she deserves the truth. Behind the cameras, people who had come only out of curiosity began whispering to one another. Because suddenly this wasn't just a corporate dispute. It was a human story. And somewhere inside Halcyon headquarters, executives watching the live broadcast realized something terrible. The silence they had relied on for years had just been broken. The next break in the case arrived from an unexpected source. Late one afternoon, Gideon Pike received a call from a man who refused to give his name at first. He was a delivery driver. For years, he had transported industrial supplies between warehouses near the harbor. And one night, 2 weeks before Elsie had been found on that frozen bench, he had seen something strange. The meeting took place in a dim diner near the waterfront. The man sat hunched over a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. "I didn't think much about it at first," he said nervously. But after seeing the news, he slid a photograph across the table. It was a still frame from a dash camera mounted in his truck. The timestamp glowed faintly in the corner. Near the fence line behind Halcyon's South Basin plant, a woman stood beside the road arguing on her phone. Even in the blurry image, her curly dark hair and worn coat were recognizable. Maris Rowan. The driver pointed at the edge of the frame. Right after this, he said quietly, a black SUV pulled up behind her. The photo showed the vehicle only partially, but the logo on the door was unmistakable. Halcyon Security. "What happened next?" Gideon asked. The man swallowed. "I drove off," he said. "Didn't want trouble." The diner fell silent. Gideon leaned back slowly. "So the last time anyone saw Maris Rowan?" "Yeah. She was near Halcyon's plant." The driver nodded, and she wasn't alone. Later that night, when Callan returned to the hospital, he found Elsie awake in her bed, drawing again with the hospital markers. "Hi," she said quietly. He sat beside her. "What are you drawing?" She held up the page. This time the river wasn't black. It was blue. 2 stick figures stood beside it, one tall, one small, holding hands beneath a yellow sun. "Who are they?" Callan asked. Elsie pointed. "That's me." Then she tapped the taller figure. "That's you." Callan felt something tighten painfully inside his chest. "And your mom?" he asked gently. Elsie's smile faded just a little. "She's coming back," she said. Callan forced himself to nod. But deep down he felt a growing certainty that the truth about Maris Rowan might be far darker than anyone had hoped. The crisis came suddenly. It was nearly midnight when the alarm sounded. Callan had fallen asleep in the chair beside Elsie's hospital bed, his head tilted back against the wall. The soft rhythm of the heart monitor had become so familiar that he barely noticed it anymore. Until it changed. The steady beeping turned into a sharp, frantic rhythm. Callan's eyes snapped open. Elsie was struggling to breathe. Her small chest heaved violently as she tried to pull air into her lungs. The oxygen line had shifted, and the monitor beside the bed flashed warning lights. "Elsie," Callan said, standing quickly. She tried to speak, but the words came out as a weak gasp. "Hurts." The coughing started again. But this time it was worse. Much worse. Her entire body shook as the cough tore through her chest. The door burst open. Nurses rushed inside. "What happened?" one asked. "She can't breathe," Callan said. Dr. Vale appeared seconds later, already pulling on gloves. Pulse dropping, a nurse called. The room exploded into motion. Machines beeped. Oxygen masks were adjusted. Medical carts rolled in. "Sir, we need you to step outside," a nurse said gently but firmly. Callan didn't move at first. Elsie's small hand reached toward him weakly through the wires and tubes. "Don't go," she whispered. The words cut straight through him. "I'm right here," he said quickly, but the nurses guided him into the hallway as the medical team surrounded the bed. The door closed, and suddenly Callan Voss, billionaire industry leader, the man who controlled billion-dollar decisions, stood helpless in a hospital corridor. The sounds from inside the room were terrifying. Doctors calling instructions, machines beeping faster. A sharp metallic clatter as equipment was moved. Time stretched painfully. Minutes felt like hours. Callan leaned against the wall, his hands clenched tightly. For the first time since this entire nightmare had begun, fear overwhelmed everything else. Not the fear of lawsuits, not the fear of media attacks, the fear of losing her. Footsteps approached. Naomi Reyes had arrived after receiving a call from the hospital. She looked at him carefully. "How bad is it? I don't know," Callan said quietly. And suddenly he remembered another hallway, another hospital, another night. His younger brother Nolan lying in a bed down the corridor struggling for breath, while their mother cried in silence beside him. No one had helped them then. No one had listened. Callan closed his eyes briefly. He couldn't lose another child like that. Not again. Finally, the door opened. Dr. Sienna Vale stepped out. Her expression was tired but calm. "She's stable," she said. Callan released a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. But the doctor continued gently. "The damage to her lungs is serious. The toxins she's been exposed to have weakened her respiratory system." She folded her arms. "She's alive tonight because someone found her when they did." Callan looked through the glass window into the room. Elsie lay sleeping again beneath the blanket, her breathing shallow but steady. Dr. Vale spoke softly beside him. "She's going to need a safe environment," she said, "and someone who doesn't walk away." Callan didn't answer. He didn't need to, because he already knew. There was no walking away anymore. Morning arrived quietly at St. Margaret's Medical Center. A pale winter sun filtered through the hospital window, reflecting softly off the snow-covered rooftops of Blackwater Harbor. Inside the pediatric room, the machines hummed gently, their steady rhythm far calmer than the chaos of the night before. Elsie slept for hours after the crisis. Her breathing was still shallow, but it no longer sounded desperate. The oxygen mask rested lightly over her face, and her small chest rose and fell beneath the blanket in a slow, fragile rhythm. Callan hadn't moved from the chair beside her bed. At some point, a nurse had brought him coffee. It sat untouched on the tray table, now cold. His phone had buzzed repeatedly throughout the night, but he had silenced it without even looking. For once in his life, the outside world had stopped mattering. All that mattered was the quiet sound of a child breathing. Near mid-morning, Elsie stirred. Her eyelashes fluttered slowly as she woke, blinking against the soft sunlight. For a moment she looked confused, as though unsure where she was. Then her eyes found Callan. "You stayed," she whispered. Her voice was hoarse but calm. Callan leaned forward slightly. "I told you I would." Elsie studied him carefully, as if trying to decide whether that promise had truly been real or just something adults said to make children feel better. Her small fingers moved weakly across the blanket until they found the edge of his sleeve. "You didn't go home, no. You didn't go to work." Callan gave a faint smile. "Work can wait." Elsie seemed to consider that for a moment. "People usually leave," she said quietly. Callan didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached over and adjusted the stuffed fox beside her pillow so it wouldn't fall off the bed. "Not everyone," he said eventually. Elsie's eyes drifted toward the window. Snow was still falling outside, small flakes spiraling slowly through the gray sky. "My mom says the river looks pretty when it snows," she said softly. "She says the snow hides all the bad things in the water." Callan felt his throat tighten. That sounds like something a hopeful person would say. Elsie smiled faintly. "She is." The room fell quiet again. After a moment, Elsie looked back at him. "Do you think she knows where I am?" she asked. Callan hesitated. "We're trying to find her," he said gently. Elsie nodded slowly. "I know." Then very softly, she said something that caught him completely off guard. "You're nice like my mom." Callan felt a sudden wave of emotion he wasn't prepared for. Before he could respond, Elsie shifted slightly beneath the blanket. The movement pulled at the oxygen line and made her wince. "Careful," Callan said quickly. He reached forward to steady the tubing. Elsie looked at him again, her tired eyes warm with quiet trust. "Thank you for helping me," she said. Then she added a word that slipped out before she seemed to realize it. "Dad." The room froze. The word hung in the air between them. Elsie's eyes widened slightly. "I didn't mean," she stammered. Her cheeks flushed pink with embarrassment. I was sleepy." Callan didn't move for a moment. Something deep inside him had shifted. For years he had built walls around himself, layers of success discipline and emotional distance strong enough to keep the world at arm's length. But that single word had slipped through every one of them. He leaned forward slowly and took her small hand in his. "You don't have to apologize," he said gently. Elsie looked uncertain. "But you're not really my." Callan squeezed her hand lightly. "You're allowed to want someone to stay." Her eyes searched his face. "Will you?" The question was simple, but the weight behind it was enormous. Callan thought about the frozen bench, the poisoned river, the missing mother, the men responsible for all of it, and the fragile child lying in this hospital bed who had somehow trusted him without hesitation. "Yes," he said quietly. "I'm staying." Elsie relaxed almost instantly. Her fingers curled slightly around his hand, as if the answer had released a tension she had been holding for days. Within minutes, her eyes began to close again. Before drifting back to sleep, she murmured something so softly that Callan almost missed it. "Okay. Dad." Callan sat there long after she had fallen asleep again. Outside the hospital window, the snow continued to fall across Blackwater Harbor. But inside that quiet room, something had changed. This was no longer just a rescue. It was becoming a family. And far across the city, inside the glass towers of Halcyon chemical executives, were just beginning to realize that the quiet billionaire they had dismissed as a nuisance had become something far more dangerous. A man who now had a daughter to protect. And men like that didn't walk away from a fight. 2 days after Elsie called him Dad, the investigation finally began to move. Callan was standing beside the hospital window when his phone rang. The caller ID showed Gideon Pike. That usually meant something important. Callan stepped quietly into the hallway before answering. "Tell me you've got something," he said. Gideon didn't waste time. "We found her notebook." Callan's heart skipped. Maris Rowan's, yes. "We're a storage facility on the south side of the harbor," Gideon replied. The unit was rented through a shell company connected to a Halcyon contractor. Callan leaned against the wall. "What's in it?" "Everything," Gideon said grimly. An hour later, Callan sat across from him in the lawyer's office again, the same dim room filled with files and legal binders. Gideon placed a worn black notebook on the table. This belonged to Maris. Callan opened it slowly. Every page was filled with handwriting. Dates, locations, water test results, sketches of pipes running beneath the riverbank. Photographs stapled into the pages showing oily residue floating on the water near the Mariners Crossing apartments. One entry was circled several times. Halcyon South Basin Discharge Pipe. Below it, Maris had written, "Children coughing more. Doctors say asthma, but the water smells worse every week." Another page carried a final note written in hurried pen. "Meeting someone inside Halcyon tomorrow. They said they have proof the executives knew about the contamination." Callan looked up. That's when she disappeared. Gideon nodded. She was getting close. The lawyer turned another page. There was a list of names: engineers, inspectors, supervisors. One name had been underlined. Daniel Rourke, Environmental Compliance Director. Gideon tapped the page. Rourke resigned from Halcyon 2 weeks ago. Callan felt the tension in the room tighten. "You think he's the whistleblower?" "Possibly," Gideon said. "But if he is, He's probably terrified right now. Silence stretched between them. Because both men understood the same thing. Maris Rowan had uncovered something dangerous enough that powerful people had decided she couldn't be allowed to speak. Callan closed the notebook carefully. "Find him," he said. "We are," Gideon replied. "But there's something else you should know." Callan looked up. "The prosecutor's office is reviewing the evidence," Gideon said. "If the documents check out—" He paused briefly. "This stops being a civil lawsuit. What does it become?" Gideon's expression hardened. "A criminal case." Later that night, when Callan returned to the hospital, Elsie was sitting upright in her bed eating applesauce. Her cheeks already looked slightly healthier than they had a week earlier. She smiled when she saw him. "You came back." "Of course I did." She pointed to the chair beside her bed. "You sit there now." Callan raised an eyebrow. "Is that my assigned seat?" Elsie nodded seriously. "That's the dad chair." Callan sat down. For the first time since this fight had begun, he allowed himself a small smile. Because while the truth about Halcyon was finally beginning to surface, the most important thing in the world right now was sitting in that hospital bed. And he wasn't going anywhere. The call came 3 days later. It was early evening when Callan's phone vibrated on the table beside Elsie's hospital bed. Outside the window, the winter sky had already turned dark, and the faint glow of streetlights reflected off the snow along the harbor. Elsie was coloring quietly with her markers when Callan glanced at the screen. Naomi Reyes. He stepped into the hallway before answering. Her voice was calm, but there was something heavy beneath it. "Callan, they found something." His stomach tightened. "Where?" "In the marshland near the South Basin Industrial Road," she said. "About a mile from Halcyon's main discharge canal." For a moment he couldn't speak. "What did they find?" Naomi hesitated. "A bag. Maris Rowan's bag." The hallway seemed suddenly smaller. "What was inside her phone?" Naomi replied quietly. "And her notebook." Callan closed his eyes briefly. So she really was there. "Yes," Naomi continued carefully. "The search team also found tire tracks in the mud nearby. SUV tires. Deep ones." Callan didn't need to ask who owned SUVs like that along the Halcyon perimeter. Security teams, corporate contractors, men who made problems disappear. "They're expanding the search," Naomi said. "For her, yes." Silence hung on the line for several seconds. Finally, Callan asked the question he had been dreading since this entire nightmare began. "Do you think she's alive?" Naomi didn't answer immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer. "I don't know." Callan stared down the hallway toward Elsie's hospital room. Through the glass, he could see her small figure sitting cross-legged on the bed, completely focused on her drawing. He thanked Naomi quietly and ended the call. For a long moment, he stood there alone. Because suddenly, the possibility he had tried to avoid was no longer distant. If Maris Rowan had been taken, then the truth about what Halcyon had done might be even worse than anyone imagined. Callan returned to the room. Elsie looked up immediately. "You were gone a long time," she said. "Just a phone call." She held up the picture she had been working on. It showed the river again. But this time she had added something new. A small lantern floating on the water. "What's that?" Callan asked. Elsie tilted her head thoughtfully. "Mom says when people get lost, sometimes you send lights so they can find their way home." Callan felt his chest tighten. "That's a beautiful idea." Elsie colored the lantern carefully. "Do you think my mom will find me again?" The question was simple, but it carried a weight that made the room feel very quiet. Callan sat beside her. He chose his words slowly. "We're doing everything we can to find her." Elsie nodded. She seemed satisfied with that answer, but Callan knew something she didn't. The search happening outside that night was no longer just about finding a missing mother. It was about discovering what powerful men had been willing to do to keep their secrets buried. And the deeper the investigators dug along the poisoned edges of Blackwater Harbor, the more dangerous the truth was becoming. Spring arrived slowly in Blackwater Harbor. The snow along the riverbanks melted into gray slush, revealing patches of frozen mud and the rust-colored stains left behind by years of industrial runoff. Cleanup crews had already begun installing barriers along the contaminated shoreline, but the damage beneath the water ran far deeper than anything visible on the surface. Inside the county courthouse, the air felt heavy with anticipation. Reporters packed the gallery. Cameras lined the back wall. Every seat was filled. At the front of the courtroom sat the executives of Halcyon Chemical. Their suits were immaculate, their expressions carefully neutral, but the evidence stacked against them had grown impossible to ignore. At the prosecution table, Gideon Pike arranged a thick stack of folders, lab reports, internal emails, water contamination data, and the notebook belonging to Maris Rowan. Each document told a piece of the same story, a company that knew and chose silence. Callan sat quietly in the gallery. Beside him, Elsie held his hand. Her health had improved enough that Dr. Vale allowed her to attend for a short time, though she still wore a small oxygen tube beneath her nose. She looked tiny among the rows of adults, but somehow she seemed braver than all of them. The judge entered. The courtroom rose. "Be seated," the judge said. The prosecutor stood first. "Your Honor, this case concerns years of environmental contamination concealed by the defendants." He paused. "And the harm done to the families who lived beside that poisoned river." Across the room, one of the Halcyon executives shifted uncomfortably. The trial had begun. And for the first time since Elsie Rowan sat shivering on that frozen bench, the truth was finally about to be told in front of the entire world. The trial lasted 3 long weeks. 3 weeks of testimony, evidence, and quiet moments when the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Experts described the contamination flowing through Blackwater Harbor's groundwater system. Environmental scientists presented maps showing how toxic chemicals from Halcyon's South Basin facility had slowly spread beneath the riverbank neighborhoods. Doctors testified about the children, the coughing, the lung damage, the unexplained illnesses that had haunted families living near the water. Then Dr. Sienna Vale took the stand. She spoke calmly without drama, but every word landed with quiet force. Elsie Rowan's condition is consistent with long-term exposure to environmental toxins, she told the court. Her lungs were already severely damaged when she was admitted. Across the courtroom, the Halcyon executives stared straight ahead. Their lawyers shifted uneasily, because the evidence had become overwhelming. Finally, Gideon Pike called the last witness, Callan Voss. He walked to the stand slowly. When the lawyer asked how he had first met Elsie, Callan didn't talk about business or lawsuits. He talked about a bench, a freezing morning, a little girl whose voice was barely strong enough to whisper. "My chest hurts." The courtroom was silent. Even the reporters stopped typing. Callan finished quietly. "That was the moment I realized someone had to listen." The verdict came 2 days later. Several Halcyon executives were found liable for environmental negligence and criminal concealment of contamination reports. The judge ordered massive fines, mandatory river cleanup, and criminal investigations into the disappearance of Maris Rowan. Outside the courthouse, reporters rushed forward as the news spread. But Callan didn't stop for the cameras. He knelt beside Elsie. "We didn't win because of money," he told her softly. "We won because the truth finally had a voice." Elsie smiled, and for the first time since that frozen morning, the future didn't feel quite so uncertain anymore. Months passed. Spring slowly transformed Blackwater Harbor. The river that once carried the dark stains of industrial runoff now moved beneath rows of floating cleanup barriers and bright yellow warning buoys. Workers in protective suits monitored the water daily, while environmental crews rebuilt the marshland along the shoreline. It would take years to heal completely, but for the first time, the city had begun trying. Life had changed for Callan, too. His once silent penthouse overlooking the harbor now held things it had never known before. Crayons scattered across the kitchen table, storybooks stacked beside the couch, and a pair of small sneakers waiting by the front door. And laughter. Elsie Rowan lived there now, not as a guest, not as a responsibility, but as his daughter. Her lungs still required careful monitoring, and she visited Dr. Vale regularly. But the color had returned to her cheeks, and the fear that once lived behind her eyes had slowly begun to fade. One evening, as the sun set over the harbor, the city gathered along the riverbank for a memorial. Hundreds of lanterns floated across the water, each one carrying the name of someone affected by the contamination. Elsie held hers carefully. Written in careful letters across the paper lantern was one name: Maris Rowan. Callan knelt beside her. "Ready?" he asked softly. Elsie nodded. Together they released the lantern onto the river. The small light drifted slowly across the dark water, joining dozens of others. Elsie watched it quietly. "Mom would like it better now," she said. Callan wrapped an arm gently around her shoulders. "Yes," he replied. "She would." Above the river, the lanterns glowed like stars reflected on the water. And somewhere within that quiet light, the city and the two people who had changed it finally began to heal. Did this story move your soul? Share your feelings in the comments and rate it from 1 to 10. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Then tap the bell icon so you never miss a new story. Click the end screen to watch another heartfelt video. See you in the next story.